In the quiet corners of our childhood memories, there lives a princess who sleeps beneath a curse. She rests in a tower surrounded by thorns, waiting for true love's kiss to break the spell that binds her. We know her story by heart: the spinning wheel, the wicked fairy, the 100-year slumber, the handsome prince who awakens her with a gentle kiss. It is a tale of romance, of destiny, of good triumphing over evil. But this story, the one we carry in our hearts, is a lie. A beautiful sanitized fiction crafted to hide a truth so dark, so disturbing, that it was buried beneath centuries of careful revision and cultural amnesia. The real story of Sleeping Beauty is not a fairy tale about love conquering all. It is something far more sinister, a medieval nightmare that reveals the brutal realities of power, violation, and survival. In a world where women were property and princes were predators, what we think we know about Sleeping Beauty comes from the Brothers Grimm, from Charles Perrault, from the gleaming animations of Walt Disney. But these are echoes, distant reverberations of a much older and infinitely darker tale. To find the true heart of this story, we must journey back through the mists of time, past the sanitized versions, past the moral lessons, past the happy endings, to a place where fairy tales were not meant for children at all. We must travel to the salons of 17th century Europe, where aristocrats gathered to share stories that would make modern audiences recoil in horror. We must uncover the forgotten manuscripts, the banned books, the tales that were deemed too dangerous, too honest, too real for the innocent ears of later generations. Only then can we understand what Sleeping Beauty truly was before it became what we needed it to be. The story begins not in the golden age of Disney, but in the shadow of medieval towers where power was absolute and women were powerless. It begins in a world where fairy tales were weapons, sharp-edged stories designed to cut through the comfortable lies that society told itself about love, marriage, and the nature of power. Long before the Brothers Grimm collected their sanitized folk tales, long before Charles Perrault refined the rough edges of oral tradition into polite literature, there was another version of Sleeping Beauty, a version so disturbing, so unflinchingly honest about the darkness that lurked beneath the surface of medieval life, that it has been systematically erased from popular memory. This is the story of how a tale about a sleeping princess became a mirror for the most uncomfortable truths about human nature. This is the story of how generations of storytellers conspired to transform a nightmare into a dream. And this is the story of what we lost when we chose comfort over truth, innocence over understanding. The earliest whispers of what would become Sleeping Beauty can be traced back to the 14th century, to a massive French romance called Perceforest. Hidden within this sprawling narrative was a tale called The Story of Troilus and Celandine, written sometime between 1330 and 1344 by an anonymous author who could never have imagined the centuries of transformation that would follow. In this primordial version, the essential elements were already present, waiting like seeds in dark soil. A baby princess, a gathering of supernatural women, a curse born from wounded pride, a finger pricked by flax, and a sleep that would not end. But these were not the gentle fairy godmothers and romantic princes of later tellings. These were the raw, unpolished archetypes of a medieval world where magic was dangerous and gods were petty. At the christening of the infant Zelandine, 3 goddesses were invited to bestow their gifts. Lucina, Themis, and Venus came to honor the child, but the ceremony was marred by a breach of etiquette that would echo through the centuries. Themis, the goddess of divine law and order, was given a knife to eat with that was not as fine as those provided for the other goddesses. This slight, this tiny failure of proper respect ignited a rage that would damn an innocent child to a fate worse than death, while Lucina promised health and good reputation to the baby. Themis wove her curse with the cold precision of divine justice. The first time the child touched flax, it would pierce her finger and cast her into a sleep from which she would never wake. It was Venus who provided the only mercy in this tale, determining that she would use her own power to preserve the girl's life, though she could not break the curse entirely. Here, in this forgotten medieval romance, we find the DNA of every Sleeping Beauty story that would follow. The supernatural women angered by perceived slights, the curse that punishes the innocent for the failures of their elders, the finger pricked while spinning, the deep enchanted sleep, the high tower that becomes both prison and sanctuary. Most significantly, we find the sexual encounter that occurs while the princess lies helpless and unconscious, an element that later versions would struggle to explain, excuse, or erase entirely. But it was in 17th century Italy where this ancient story would take its most shocking and influential form. It was here, in the hands of a Neapolitan writer named Giambattista Basile, that Sleeping Beauty would be transformed into something that makes even the darkest modern horror films seem tame. By comparison, Basile was not writing for children. In his world, fairy tales were sophisticated adult entertainment, shared in the salons and courts of the aristocracy. They were vehicles for social commentary, political satire, and unflinching examinations of power and its abuses. When he set out to retell the ancient story of the sleeping princess, he created something that would haunt European literature for centuries to come. His version, published posthumously in his collection known as the Pentamerone between 1634 and 1636, bore the deceptively simple title of Sun, Moon, and Talia. It appeared to be just another fairy tale, another story of magic and enchantment. But beneath its surface lay a narrative so disturbing, so brutally honest about the realities of medieval life, that it would eventually be deemed too dangerous for popular consumption. The story began familiarly enough. A great lord had a daughter named Talia, and at her birth wise men and astrologers gathered to cast her horoscope. Their predictions were ominous. The child would be in mortal danger from a splinter of flax. Determined to protect his daughter, the father commanded that no flax would ever enter his house, believing that he could cheat fate through vigilance and absolute control. But destiny, as Basile understood, was not so easily thwarted. Years passed, and Talia grew into a beautiful young woman, sheltered and protected in her father's house. One day, she encountered an old woman spinning flax on a spindle. Curious about this forbidden substance, she asked if she might try her hand at the craft. The moment she began to spin, the prophecy fulfilled itself with terrible precision. A splinter of flax lodged beneath her fingernail, and she collapsed into the enchanted sleep that had been foretold. Here, the familiar elements of the tale seem intact. We have the curse, the spinning, the sleep. But what Basile did next would separate his version from every sanitized retelling that followed. This was not a story about patient waiting or noble princes. This was a story about what happens when power encounters helplessness, when desire meets opportunity, and when society's most comfortable lies are stripped away to reveal the predatory truth beneath. The 17th century was a time when fairy tales served a very different function than they do today. They were not bedtime stories for children, but sophisticated entertainment for adults who understood that the world was a dangerous place where evil often triumphed and justice was a luxury that few could afford. In the Italy of Giambattista Basile, fairy tales were not gentle bedtime stories whispered to sleepy children. They were sharp-edged instruments of truth, wielded by sophisticated courtiers who understood that the most profound revelations often came wrapped in the language of fantasy. The salons of Naples buzzed with tales that cut through the comfortable lies of polite society. Stories that dared to speak the unspeakable truths about power, desire, and the brutal realities of a world where women existed at the mercy of men who took what they wanted. Basile's son, Moon and Talia, was born from this tradition of unflinching honesty. When he chose to retell the ancient story of the sleeping princess, he created something that would make modern audiences recoil in horror. His version did not flinch from the darkest implications of the tale. It did not soften the harsh edges or provide comfortable moral lessons. Instead, it held up a mirror to the medieval world and forced its readers to confront what they saw reflected there. In Basile's telling, when Talia collapsed into her enchanted sleep, her father was overcome with grief. Unable to bear the sight of his daughter's lifeless form, he placed her upon a velvet chair in one of his country estates and abandoned the palace forever, sealing it shut and walking away from his broken heart. The princess was left alone in her tower, beautiful and helpless, a sleeping treasure waiting for someone to discover her. Years passed in silence. The estate stood empty, slowly being reclaimed by thorns and wild vines. Then one day a king was hunting in the nearby forest when his falcon flew through an open window of the abandoned palace. Following his bird, the king entered the mysterious building and began to explore its dusty corridors and forgotten chambers. He climbed the stairs to the highest tower, and there he found her. Talia, still beautiful, still young, still locked in her supernatural slumber. The king was struck by her extraordinary beauty, and in that moment Basile reveals the true nature of power when it encounters helplessness. This was no gentle prince moved by pure love. This was a medieval king who saw something he desired and took it regardless of consent, regardless of consequence. What happened next in Basile's original tale is something that later storytellers would spend centuries trying to explain, excuse, or erase entirely. The king did not awaken Talia with a kiss. He did not wait for her consent or seek to break the curse through noble means. He simply took what he wanted from her sleeping form, satisfying his desires and then departing, leaving her still unconscious, still cursed, and now carrying the consequences of his violation. 9 months later, still deep in her enchanted sleep, Talia gave birth to twins. The babies, born into a world where their mother could not protect them, were left to fend for themselves. One of the infants, searching desperately for nourishment, began to suck on Talia's finger. In doing so, the child drew out the splinter of flax that had caused the original curse. The pain of this extraction finally broke the spell, and Talia awakened to find herself a mother in a world she no longer recognized. This was the moment that revealed the true genius of Basil's storytelling. He had created a narrative that forced his readers to confront uncomfortable questions about power, consent, and survival. Talia awoke not to find true love waiting for her, but to discover that she had been violated while helpless, that she was now responsible for two children she had never chosen to conceive, and that her fate remained tied to a man who had seen her not as a person but as an object for his pleasure. When the king eventually returned to the palace and found Talia awake, he was delighted by what he considered his good fortune. He told her what had transpired, though Basil makes it clear that he spoke of his actions as if they were natural and justified. The king named the twins Sun and Moon, claiming them as his own, and began visiting Talia regularly, establishing her as his mistress while maintaining his marriage to his queen. But Basil was not finished with his dark revelations. The story took an even more sinister turn when the king's wife discovered his secret. The queen, consumed with jealousy and rage, devised a plan that revealed the capacity for evil that lurked within even the most refined members of society. She summoned Talia and the children to the palace under false pretenses, intending to murder them all and serve them to her unsuspecting husband as a meal. The cook, horrified by the queen's commands, secretly saved the children and substituted goat meat for the terrible feast. When the queen finally revealed her supposed revenge to the king, gloating over what she believed she had made him consume, the truth emerged. The king, in his rage, ordered his wife to be burned alive in the very fire she had prepared for Talia and the children. In the end, Basil's tale concluded with what appeared to be a happy ending. The king married Talia, legitimizing their children and establishing them all in positions of wealth and power. But this resolution could not erase the darkness that had preceded it. The story remained a brutal examination of a world where women were property, where power was absolute, and where survival often required accepting the unacceptable. The tale of Sun, Moon, and Talia was not an aberration. It was representative of how fairy tales functioned in the 17th century, serving as vehicles for exploring the most uncomfortable aspects of human nature and social organization. These stories were told in salons where sophisticated audiences understood that the world was not a place where good always triumphed over evil, where love conquered all, or where justice was guaranteed. The aristocratic women who gathered in the salons of Paris and Naples in the mid-17th century lived in a world where their own agency was severely limited. They could not choose their husbands, control their property, or determine their own destinies. The fairy tales they shared and created served as a form of coded resistance, allowing them to explore themes of female power, sexual agency, and the critique of patriarchal authority within the safety of fictional narrative. When these women told stories of sleeping princesses and wicked queens, of fairy godmothers and magical transformations. They were not simply entertaining their audiences. They were engaging in a sophisticated form of social commentary, using the language of fantasy to examine the harsh realities of their own lives. The tales they created were often dark, complex, and morally ambiguous because the world they lived in was dark, complex, and morally ambiguous. The transformation of these adult tales into children's stories would not begin until the late 17th century, as the Age of Enlightenment brought new attitudes toward childhood, education, and the proper content for young minds. But in Basile's time, fairy tales were decidedly mature literature, designed to challenge rather than comfort. To provoke rather than soothe, the Italian master had created something that was both entertainment and warning, both fantasy and brutal realism. His Sleeping Beauty was not a passive princess waiting for rescue, but a survivor who had to navigate a world where her own choices had been stolen from her before she was even conscious enough to make them. This was the world that would soon transform the ancient tale yet again. This time in the hands of a French writer who understood that stories, like society itself, could be refined, polished, and made more palatable without losing their essential power. Charles Perrault, writing in the court of Louis XIV, would take Basile's brutal masterpiece and reshape it into something that could serve a very different purpose for a very different audience. Perrault was a master of literary alchemy. He possessed the rare ability to take the raw, unforgiving truths of earlier tales and transmute them into stories that could function both as entertainment and as instruments of social education. When he encountered Basile's Sun, Moon, and Talia, he recognized its power but also understood its limitations. The Italian tale was too dark, too explicit, too honest for the refined sensibilities of the French court. In 1697, Perrault published his version under the title La Belle au Bois Dormant, The Sleeping Beauty in the Wood, as part of his collection Histoires ou Contes du Temps Passé. This was not merely a translation or adaptation of Basile's work. It was a complete reimagining, a careful reconstruction that preserved the essential elements of the tale while fundamentally altering its moral landscape. Perrault's genius lay in his understanding of what could be changed and what must remain. He kept the curse, the spinning wheel, the 100-year sleep, and the awakening. But he transformed the mechanism of that awakening from something brutal and violating into something that appeared, at least on the surface, to be pure and consensual. In his version, the princess awakens not from the pain of childbirth, but from the gentle presence of a prince who enters her chamber. This single change rewrote the entire meaning of the story. Where Basile had created a tale about the consequences of absolute power and the survival of the powerless, Perrault crafted a narrative about destiny, patience, and the triumph of true love. The prince in his version was not a predator but a hero, guided by fate to find his sleeping bride at the precise moment when the 100 years of her curse were complete. But Perrault was too sophisticated a storyteller to simply create a sanitized fairy tale. He understood that his aristocratic audience still craved the complexity and moral ambiguity that made stories memorable and meaningful. So while he removed the explicit violence and violation from the awakening, he preserved the essential darkness of the tale. by focusing on what happened after the princess opened her eyes. In Perrault's version, the prince and princess fall in love instantly and marry in secret in the chapel of the sleeping palace. They live together in hidden happiness for 2 years, during which she bears him 2 children, a daughter named Aurora and a son named Day. But their joy is shadowed by a terrible secret. The prince has not told his bride that his mother is an ogress, a creature with an insatiable hunger for human flesh, particularly the tender meat of young children. When the prince finally inherits his father's throne and can acknowledge his family publicly, he must leave them to attend to matters of state. During his absence, his ogress mother sees her opportunity. She commands her cook to prepare little Aurora for her dinner, planning to tell her son that wolves had devoured the child. The cook, horrified by this command, substitutes a lamb and hides the little girl. Not satisfied with her deception, the ogress next demands that little Day be served to her. Again, the cook saves the child and provides a young goat instead. Finally, the ogress orders that the princess herself be killed and prepared, claiming that she will tell her son his wife died of illness. This time, the cook plans to substitute a young hind, but the princess, learning of her mother-in-law's cannibalistic nature, prepares to sacrifice herself to save her children. At the crucial moment, the prince returns unexpectedly and discovers his mother's monstrous plot. In her rage at being thwarted, the ogress throws herself into a pit filled with serpents, dragons, and other venomous creatures, meeting a death as grotesque as her appetites. The prince, princess, and their children are finally free to live openly and happily. Perrault had accomplished something remarkable. He had preserved the essential darkness of the original tale while making it acceptable for a more refined audience. His ogress mother-in-law served the same narrative function as Basile's jealous queen, representing the destructive power of unchecked appetite and the threat that always lurked beneath the surface of civilized society. More importantly, Perrault had demonstrated how stories could be adapted to serve changing cultural needs without losing their psychological power. His version still contained elements that would trouble modern readers. The princess remained fundamentally passive, awakening only when a man decided her time of waiting was over. The children were still in mortal danger from a cannibalistic relative. The resolution still required violence and death to achieve happiness. But by changing the mechanism of awakening from violation to apparent consent, Perrault had created a version that could function as both entertainment and moral instruction. His tale could be read as a story about the rewards of patience, the power of true love, and the ultimate triumph of good over evil. It could also be read by more sophisticated audiences as a complex examination of power, family, and the thin veneer of civilization that separated humanity from its most primitive instincts. The transformation that Perrault accomplished was part of a broader cultural shift that was occurring across Europe in the late 17th century. The Baroque world of Basile, with its unflinching examination of power and sexuality, was giving way to a more refined sensibility that valued elegance, propriety, and moral instruction over brutal honesty. This shift was particularly pronounced in the literary salons of Paris, where aristocratic women gathered to discuss literature, philosophy, and the social issues of their day. These salons had become centers of cultural refinement, places where the rough edges of earlier traditions were polished into more acceptable forms. The women who frequented these gatherings were well educated and sophisticated, but they also lived within a social system that severely limited their agency and autonomy. For these women, fairy tales served a complex function. They provided a safe space for exploring themes of female power and resistance, but they also had to operate within the constraints of what was considered acceptable discourse. A tale like Basile's Sun, Moon, and Talia, with its explicit depiction of sexual violence, would have been considered too crude for the refined atmosphere of the salon. Perrault's genius lay in his ability to preserve the psychological complexity of the original tale, while adapting it to the sensibilities of his audience. His version allowed sophisticated readers to engage with themes of power, desire, and danger while maintaining the fiction that they were simply enjoying an elegant entertainment. The success of Perrault's approach can be measured by the lasting influence of his version. While Basile's tale remained buried in scholarly collections, Perrault's Sleeping Beauty became the foundation for virtually every subsequent adaptation of the story. His innovations, particularly the idea that the princess awakens through the power of true love rather than through violation, became so embedded in popular consciousness that they came to seem like natural and inevitable elements of the tale. But even Perrault's refined version contained elements that would prove troubling to later generations. The passive nature of the princess who sleeps through the most crucial events of the story would eventually be seen as problematic in an age that valued female agency and independence. The violence of the ogress mother-in-law, with her cannibalistic appetites and gruesome death, would be deemed too frightening for children's literature. Most significantly, the very premise of the tale that a woman could be cursed into helplessness and then claimed by a man who happened upon her would come to seem deeply problematic as ideas about consent and autonomy evolved. Future adapters of the story would struggle with these elements, finding ways to preserve the magical appeal of the tale while addressing its more troubling implications. The tension between preserving the psychological power of the story and adapting it to changing moral sensibilities would drive every subsequent version of Sleeping Beauty. Each generation would find new ways to soften the harsh edges, to explain away the uncomfortable elements, and to transform the tale into something that reflected their own values and beliefs. But in doing so, each adaptation would also move further away from the original psychological insights that had made the story so powerful and enduring. The tale that had begun as an unflinching examination of power, fate, and survival would gradually be transformed into something safer, more comfortable, and ultimately less true to the dark realities of human experience. The process of transformation that began with Perrault would continue across the centuries, driven by forces far greater than any individual storyteller's vision. As Europe moved through the Enlightenment and into the modern age, the very purpose of storytelling itself was undergoing a revolution. Tales that had once served as sophisticated adult entertainment were being reimagined as vehicles for childhood education and moral instruction. This shift was not accidental. It reflected profound changes in how society understood childhood, morality, and the proper function of literature. The aristocratic salons where dark tales of power and violation had been shared as cutting social commentary were giving way to a new world where stories were expected to teach rather than challenge, to comfort rather than disturb. The Brothers Grimm, collecting their tales in early 19th century Germany, embodied this transformation perfectly. Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm were not merely storytellers but scholars, part of a broader romantic movement that sought to preserve what they believed were the authentic voices of the common people. When they encountered the Sleeping Beauty tale, they saw an opportunity to create something that could serve their vision of what folklore should be. Their version, published as Dornröschen or Little Briar Rose, represented another crucial step in the domestication of the ancient story. The Grimms stripped away even more of the tale's disturbing elements, creating a narrative that was simpler, cleaner, and more suitable for their intended audience of families and children. In their telling, the curse came from a 13th wise woman who had been excluded from the christening feast, not out of deliberate slight, but simply because the king possessed only 12 golden plates. This change transformed the curse from an act of divine vengeance into something more like an unfortunate accident, reducing the moral complexity that had made earlier versions so compelling. The Grimms also eliminated entirely the second half of Perrault's tale, the story of the ogress mother-in-law and her cannibalistic desires. Their version ended with the prince's kiss awakening the princess, followed immediately by their marriage and the promise of eternal happiness. Gone were the hidden children, the monstrous in-laws, the questions about what happens after the fairy tale ending. This truncation was not merely an editorial choice, but a philosophical statement. The Grimms were creating a new kind of story, one that emphasized moral clarity over psychological complexity, one that provided clear lessons about virtue rewarded and evil punished. Their Sleeping Beauty was no longer a survivor navigating a dangerous world, but a passive symbol of purity preserved through divine intervention. Yet even in their sanitized version, traces of the original darkness remained. The princess still fell under a curse through no fault of her own. She still spent a century in helpless unconsciousness. She still awakened only when a man decided her time of waiting was over. The fundamental power dynamics that had driven the story from its earliest incarnations persisted beneath the surface, waiting for future generations to rediscover and question. The success of the Grimm version established a template that would dominate popular understanding of the tale for generations. Their Sleeping Beauty became the standard against which all other versions would be measured, the baseline from which future adaptations would either conform or deliberately diverge. But the story's journey through cultural transformation was far from over. The 19th and 20th centuries would bring new challenges, new sensibilities, and new demands for what stories could and should do. The rise of psychology as a science would introduce new ways of understanding the tale's deeper meanings. The emergence of feminism would raise uncomfortable questions about the princess's passivity and the prince's role as her supposed savior. Most significantly, the advent of new media, particularly film and animation, would provide unprecedented opportunities to reshape the story for mass audiences. The visual power of cinema could create new emotional connections to the characters while simultaneously making it easier to gloss over the more troubling aspects of the narrative. Walt Disney, when he chose Sleeping Beauty as the subject for his 1959 animated film, was building upon centuries of gradual transformation. His version would represent the culmination of the sanitization process that had begun with Perrault, creating a Sleeping Beauty so removed from its origins that audiences could engage with it as pure fantasy, unburdened by the weight of its darker history. Disney's Aurora was the ultimate evolution of the passive princess, beautiful and kind, but lacking any agency or complexity that might trouble young viewers. His Prince Philip was the perfect romantic hero, brave and noble without a trace of the predatory nature that had characterized his predecessors. Most importantly, Disney's version was explicitly designed for children, with bright colors, memorable songs, and a tone that never wavered from wholesome entertainment. The success of Disney's adaptation effectively completed the transformation that had been underway for centuries. His Sleeping Beauty became the version that most people encountered first and remembered most vividly. For millions of viewers, Disney's Aurora was not an adaptation of an older story, but the story itself, the original from which all other versions were merely variations. This cultural amnesia was not accidental but inevitable. Each generation tends to assume that the version of a story they grew up with is the authentic one, the way it was always meant to be told. The dark complexity of Basile's Sun, Moon, and Talia, the moral ambiguity of Perrault's ogress mother-in-law, the psychological insights of the medieval Persephorist, all of these became footnotes in scholarly collections, preserved by academics but forgotten by popular culture. And so we have traveled the long, winding path from the medieval darkness of Persephorist, through the brutal honesty of Basile's Italian nightmare to the refined salons of Perrault's France, and finally to the sanitized magic of Disney's animated kingdom. We have witnessed the systematic erasure of a story's true soul, the careful burial of uncomfortable truths beneath layers of cultural revision and moral sanitization. The Sleeping Beauty we think we know, the gentle princess awaiting true love's kiss, is the final product of centuries of deliberate forgetting. Each generation took the raw, unforgiving truths of their predecessors and polished them until they reflected not the harsh realities of human experience, but the comfortable fantasies we preferred to believe. What we have lost in this transformation is not just a story, but a mirror. The original tale, in all its disturbing complexity, forced its audiences to confront the brutal realities of power, the vulnerability of the helpless, and the thin veneer of civilization that separates humanity from its darkest impulses. It was a story that refused to lie about the world as it was, even as it wrapped those truths in the language of fantasy and magic. Perhaps there is wisdom in both versions, the ancient and the modern. Perhaps we need our sanitized fairy tales to give children hope and wonder. But we also need to remember what came before, to understand the dark soil from which our brightest stories grew. For in forgetting the original Sleeping Beauty, we have not just lost a tale. We have lost a piece of our own history, a record of how our ancestors understood the world and their place within it. The true story of Sleeping Beauty is not just the story of a cursed princess. It is the story of how we as a culture choose what truths to remember and what truths to forget. It is the story of how we transform nightmares into dreams, darkness into light, and uncomfortable realities into comfortable lies. And perhaps in the end, that transformation is the most human story of all.